The guards at the front gate never bothered to meet my eyes when I stepped forward. One of them let out a short laugh, barely loud enough to hear, like the situation had already been decided. The other looked down at my boots, then slowly up to my chest, and shook his head with a tired kind of confidence. The floodlights behind them burned white and flat, stripping faces of detail. Inside the fence, radios crackled with calm routine traffic, and that contrast made my shoulders tighten. One of the guards told me to step back. He did not raise his voice. He did not sound angry. It was worse than that. He sounded bored, like I was an interruption instead of an officer standing in front of him. I rested my hand on the access panel beside the gate. I did not activate it yet. I just felt the cold metal under my palm and waited. The night felt wrong. Too still for a base this large. Somewhere beyond that gate, people were sleeping, planning, trusting systems they would never see, systems that only mattered when someone decided to test them. The guard closest to me smirked and said something I will carry for the rest of my life. I made one choice. I touched the panel, and the base answered. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I was stationed at a training installation outside a small desert town in southern New Mexico in the year 2014. It was not the kind of place people talked about, not the kind of base that made the news or showed up in recruitment videos. It existed for one purpose only: to test systems, people, and patience under pressure. I was assigned there as a logistics and communications officer, the kind of role that disappears into the background when everything works and suddenly becomes very visible when it does not. That week, the base was running a large-scale joint exercise. Multiple units rotated through in waves, each one bringing its own vehicles, equipment, personalities, and assumptions. Convoys moved in and out at all hours. Radios stayed hot day and night. Simulated threats were layered on top of real fatigue. Every movement depended on timing, accuracy, and trust in systems that most people never thought about. My responsibility was simple on paper. I ensured that clearance updates, access permissions, and communications changes reached the right people at the right time. In practice, it meant chasing small failures before they grew teeth, a delayed update, a missed confirmation, a system that lagged just enough to create confusion. Those were the cracks where real accidents were born. I had learned early in my career that logistics does not feel heroic. There are no dramatic speeches or visible victories. There is only prevention. And prevention is invisible when it works. That morning started like many others. The sun was already high, turning the desert pale and unforgiving. Dust hung in the air, kicked up by tracked vehicles rolling back from the range. Inside operations, people were tired but focused. Coffee cups crowded desks. Radios murmured constantly. On the surface, everything looked steady. Then, one clearance update failed to propagate through a secondary access system. It was small. A single line of authorization that did not move from one network to another. The kind of error that gets dismissed because nothing bad has happened yet. But I had seen this pattern before. When systems disagree, people hesitate. When people hesitate, minutes are lost. And in an environment like that, minutes mattered. According to my orders, I had full authorization to move between restricted zones and command areas. According to one gate system, I did not. That disconnect was more dangerous than any simulated enemy we were tracking that week. I called it in. I logged it. I waited for the update to correct itself. It did not. Operations needed confirmation in person. The exercise timeline was tightening, and delaying another hour would have forced a reshuffle that no one wanted. I was told to carry the authorization directly, verify the failure, and report back. Straightforward. Routine. Necessary. I left operations on foot, walking across sun-baked concrete toward the perimeter gate. My uniform was regulation. My identification was current. My name was already in the system, just not in the right place at the right time. That happens more often than people admit. At the gate, the guards were doing their job the way they had been trained. Challenge, verify, control access. I respected that. I had stood that kind of watch earlier in my career. I knew the pressure of being responsible for what crossed your line. What I did not expect was how quickly procedure would blur into assumption. They scanned my identification. They ran my information. The system flagged a discrepancy. Instead of escalating the issue, they settled into certainty. The kind that feels safer than uncertainty. The kind that assumes the system cannot be wrong. I explained calmly. I referenced the exercise order. I requested they contact operations. They hesitated. One of them glanced at the screen again, then at me, then away. The other shifted his weight and sighed. It was not hostility. It was dismissal. Like I was complicating a simple situation by insisting on accuracy. I could feel the weight of the delay pressing in. Not loudly, quietly. Radios inside the base continued their steady rhythm. Vehicles continued to move. Everyone trusted that access control was functioning as designed. But it was not. Standing there, I realized how fragile that trust was, how much of military order depends on people believing that the system in front of them is correct, even when reality says otherwise. That was the moment I understood that this was no longer just a paperwork problem. It was a test. Not of authority, of responsibility. And tests do not announce themselves when they begin. They reveal themselves when someone decides whether to act or step aside. The longer I stood there, the more the calm around me began to feel unreal. The guards relaxed into the moment instead of tightening up. One of them leaned his shoulder against the concrete barrier, helmet tipped back slightly. The other made a quiet joke about how these exercises always found new ways to waste time. To them, the delay was an inconvenience, a minor disruption in an otherwise ordinary shift. To me, it was a widening gap. Beyond the fence, radios were already active. I could hear call signs and check-ins drifting through the night air, steady and confident. Units were moving according to timelines built on the assumption that access control was functioning correctly. If I did not get through that gate, the clearance update did not get through. And if the update did not get through, decisions would be made using incomplete information. I asked them to run my credentials again. They did. Same result. The system disagreed with me, and that was enough for them. The certainty settled in quickly, not aggressive, not hostile, just firm. One of them told me the computer did not lie. Another suggested I head back and sort it out in the morning, as if time were something we had in excess. I felt the pressure building in my chest, not sharp or panicked, but steady, like a slow increase in weight. I had been in louder situations before. This was different. This was the kind of moment that slips past attention because nothing is visibly wrong yet. I thought about how many incidents begin this way, not with alarms or gunfire, but with someone assuming a small delay does not matter. With someone trusting a screen more than a person standing in front of them. I asked them to contact the duty officer. One guard reached for his radio, hesitated, then lowered his hand. He said the officer was busy. The other nodded, relieved to have a reason not to escalate. It was easier to wait. Easier to let the system sort itself out. Minutes passed. The air cooled. The desert went quiet in that way. It does just before dawn. Inside the base, engines started and stopped. Doors opened and closed. Life went on. I stood there and watched the gap grow wider. I replayed my orders in my head, not to reassure myself, but to anchor my next decision. I knew exactly what authority I carried. I also knew how rarely that authority is recognized without visible markers. Rank on paper does not always translate at a gate, especially when expectations are already set. One of the guards finally looked at me and said, almost kindly, that I should not take it personally. That line stayed with me. Because it was personal, whether they meant it to be or not. It was personal in the way trust always is. I weighed my options carefully. I could step back, report the failure later, and hope nothing downstream went wrong. Or I could force the issue and risk being seen as difficult, disruptive, or worse. What made the choice harder was how reasonable everyone else appeared. No raised voices, no threats. Just a shared belief that waiting was harmless. But I knew better. I had seen what happens when updates arrive late. I had watched minor discrepancies turn into near misses. I had read reports written after the fact, explaining how no one realized the risk until it was too late to change the outcome. Standing there, I understood that if this went wrong, no one would remember the joke or the leaning guard. They would remember the result, and that knowledge settled into me, quiet and heavy. I took a breath, slow and deliberate, and prepared to do what my position required, whether anyone liked it or not. Calls began coming over the gate radio, asking why I had not checked in yet. At first, they were casual, a status question. Then they sharpened. Names were repeated. Someone asked for a timeline. The guards straightened almost in unison, the easy posture gone. One of them took his hand off the barrier. The other adjusted his helmet and looked at the screen again, like it might suddenly change its mind. A junior leader stepped closer, his voice lower now. He asked who I was supposed to report to. I told him. His expression shifted just slightly. Unease crept in where confidence had been. No one wanted to be the person who stopped the wrong officer, especially not during a live exercise with eyes already turning toward the gate. But no one wanted to be the person who overrode the system either. That was the real problem. The system had spoken, and even though it was wrong, it carried weight. Screens do that. They feel final. They remove doubt from the people standing behind them. If something goes wrong, blame can be pushed onto a line of code instead of a decision. I considered demanding a supervisor. I could have raised my voice, cited regulations, pushed rank harder. It would have created motion. It might even have worked, but it would not have fixed what mattered. Even if a supervisor waved me through, the faulty clearance would still exist. The same error would sit in the system, waiting for the next moment to surface, waiting for someone else to run into it when the stakes were higher and the timing worse. This was not about getting myself inside the fence. It was about making sure the base could trust its own safeguards. The calls continued. Operations wanted to know why confirmation had not arrived. The junior leader tried again to explain the discrepancy, his words careful now. I watched him choose language that protected everyone involved. No accusations, no admissions, just uncertainty. I felt the humiliation settle deeper, not from insults, but from invisibility, from being present and untrusted at the same time, from knowing the truth and having no simple way to make it matter. The guards avoided my eyes again, but this time it was different, not dismissive, defensive. They were caught between two authorities, and neither felt safe to challenge. I stepped closer to the access panel mounted beside the gate. It was old, scratched from years of use, its surface worn smooth by thousands of hands that never questioned it. I had installed similar systems earlier in my career. I knew exactly what sat behind that metal casing. Redundancies, overrides, safeguards built for moments when people could not agree. I rested my hand near it and paused. One guard noticed and stiffened. He told me I was not authorized to touch that panel. His voice was sharper now, edged with fear. He was right, in a way. That function was restricted, not to rank, but to role. And my role gave me access whether he believed it or not. I thought about how much the military depends on people trusting that someone, somewhere, will act when systems fail. How often that responsibility falls on individuals who would rather avoid conflict altogether. The junior leader spoke up again, quieter. He asked me what I was planning to do. I told him the truth. I said the system needed to answer to command, not opinion. I said this would settle the question without argument. He did not object. He did not approve either. He stepped back, creating space, physically and mentally distancing himself from what was about to happen. The calls from inside the base grew more urgent. A vehicle idled somewhere behind the fence. Radios overlapped, voices stacking on top of each other. The calm of earlier was gone, replaced by controlled tension. I knew that once I acted, there would be no undoing it. Logs would be created. Timelines would be fixed in record. Someone would have to explain why the system failed and why it took so long to respond. I also knew that if I did nothing, the exercise would continue on a compromised foundation, and no one would realize it until after the damage was done. I placed my palm flat against the cold metal of the panel. In that moment, it was no longer about rank or respect or embarrassment. It was about responsibility moving past hesitation, about choosing action over comfort. I did not look at the guards. I initiated the command verification sequence and waited for the system to speak for itself. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the secure command application, the one most people never see and fewer ever touch. It was reserved for system failures and emergency verification, buried behind layers of authentication precisely so it would not be used casually. My hands were steady. There was no anger in me at that point, no need to prove anything. This was not personal anymore. It was procedural. I entered my credentials, confirmed my identity, and selected priority verification. The request tied directly to my authorization profile and the convoy schedule already moving across the exercise timeline. Every field was filled with facts, names, locations, timestamps. No emotion, just data telling the system to reconcile itself. I pressed confirm. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The night held its breath. Then radios around the gate erupted almost at once. Voices that had been relaxed minutes earlier sharpened instantly. Call signs overlapped. Someone repeated my name, slower this time, like they were making sure they had it right. One of the guards stiffened when his radio crackled with a new tone, higher and more urgent. He listened, eyes widening just enough to give him away. The other guard straightened fully, hands dropping to his sides, posture snapping into something closer to attention. From inside the base, a lieutenant broke into a run toward the gate. I recognized him immediately. We had worked together during previous exercises. He did not slow down as he approached. He was already speaking into his radio, already apologizing to someone on the other end, already piecing together what had gone wrong. He reached the gate out of breath and looked from me to the guards to the access panel. His face drained of color as the picture settled in. The clearance had been valid the entire time. The system had failed to update. He said it out loud, partly to me and partly to himself, like naming it might make it easier to swallow. A delayed propagation between networks. A missed confirmation. Exactly what I had flagged earlier that morning. Exactly the kind of error everyone hopes will correct itself without intervention. The lieutenant apologized directly this time. Not hurried, not defensive, just honest. He told me operations had already received the verification and were standing by. The delay was logged. Command was aware. The posture at the gate shifted instantly. The guards who had laughed earlier now avoided my eyes for a different reason, not dismissal. Realization. The junior leader took a step back, his shoulders tight, processing how close he had come to being the reason this turned into something worse. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The system had spoken, and it had spoken loudly enough to carry authority without emotion. The gate opened smoothly, hydraulics humming like nothing had ever been wrong. I stepped through without ceremony, no satisfaction. no triumph, just relief that the gap had closed before it widened any further. As we walked toward operations, the lieutenant explained what the verification had triggered. Internal checkpoints had rerouted authority channels automatically. Supervisors had been notified. Logs were already being reviewed. The base had adjusted its posture in response to a single touch of confirmation. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the apology, not the embarrassment on the guards' faces, but how quickly the entire installation responded once the right signal reached the right place, how much power existed quietly beneath the surface, waiting for someone to activate it correctly. Inside operations, people looked up as I entered, expressions shifting from concern to focus. There were no questions about why I had been delayed. They already knew. Screens updated. Timelines adjusted. The exercise moved forward, cleaner now, tighter, built on information that finally matched reality. Later, when the noise settled and the day moved on, I thought about how close this had come to being written off as nothing, how easily everyone at that gate had trusted a screen over a person standing in front of them, how tempting it is to let systems replace judgment entirely. What struck me most was how fast confidence collapses when certainty is exposed as false. One moment, the guards had been relaxed, joking, secure in their authority. The next, they were silent, confronting the truth that procedure without understanding can be just as dangerous as no procedure at all. I did not say anything to them before moving on. There was no lesson I could deliver that the moment itself had not already taught. The logs would speak. The review would follow. And the next time an update lagged, someone would hesitate less before questioning the screen. That night did not end with punishment or raised voices. It ended with alignment, systems matching orders, people matching responsibility, and a reminder that authority does not need to announce itself when it finally arrives. The gate opened quickly, almost too quickly, like it was trying to erase what had just happened. The metal slid back and the red light shifted to green. Salutes appeared where smirks had been only minutes before. They were sharp and correct, and suddenly very serious. I acknowledged them without slowing my pace. There was nothing to say. Words would have added weight where none was needed. I moved through the gate and toward operations, boots striking concrete in a steady rhythm that matched my breathing. Behind me, the guards reset their posture and their silence followed me like an echo. Whatever jokes had lived at that gate earlier were gone now, replaced by awareness. Inside operations, the air was dense with focus. Large screens lined the walls, each one tracking a different piece of the exercise. Convoy routes adjusted in real time, lines shifting slightly as updated permissions finally flowed through the network. Status indicators flickered from yellow to green. Timelines tightened. The base was correcting itself, muscle memory kicking in now that the signal matched reality. We were late, but we were not too late. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. I stepped to my station and logged in without ceremony. A few heads turned. No one asked where I had been. They already knew. When systems update, the truth travels faster than explanations ever could. A captain caught my eye from across the room and gave a small nod. Not approval, not praise, just acknowledgement. I focused on the data. The clearance error had created a ripple, not a wave. Vehicles that had paused were moving again. Units that had hesitated were back on schedule. Communications flowed cleaner now, stripped of the uncertainty that had lingered earlier. Still, the room carried a quiet tension, the kind that settles in after a near miss. No alarms had sounded. No one had raised their voice. But everyone understood how narrow the margin had been. I pulled up the logs and traced the failure backward. A delayed sync between networks, buried deep enough that it had gone unnoticed during routine checks. Not negligence. Not sabotage. Just complexity doing what it does best when left unchallenged. Around me, People worked faster without appearing rushed. Chairs scraped softly. Keyboards clicked in uneven bursts. Someone poured fresh coffee without a word. The exercise moved forward, but the room had changed. Awareness had sharpened. Trust had been recalibrated. No one mentioned the delay out loud. Not in that moment. The military has a way of saving conversations for later, for after-action reviews and closed rooms. Out here, the priority was stability. Keep the exercise moving. Keep the people safe. I glanced at the clock. Time had been lost, but not enough to force a reset. That fact settled in my chest like a slow exhale. Relief, controlled and private. From the corner of my eye, I saw the lieutenant who had run to the gate earlier speaking quietly with a senior officer. Their heads were close together, voices low. There was no anger in their posture, just calculation. Lessons already forming. I knew what would follow. Reports. Reviews. Recommendations that would adjust protocols and tighten verification thresholds. Nothing dramatic, nothing public, but necessary. What struck me in that moment was how quickly respect returns once uncertainty is removed. Not because of rank or gender or volume, but because clarity restores order. The base did not respond to embarrassment or apology. It responded to accurate information delivered in time. I stayed focused on my screens, adjusting routes, confirming handoffs, making sure no other discrepancies hid in the background. My role was not to dwell on what had happened, but to ensure it did not repeat itself. Still, the image stayed with me. The shift at the gate. The sudden seriousness. The way posture changes when authority arrives without shouting. The exercise stabilized fully within the hour. Units completed their movements, no injuries, no equipment damage. On paper, it would read like a routine day. But for those of us who knew, the memory lingered, because sometimes the most important moments in military life are the ones that almost become something else. Later that evening, when the exercise finally slowed and the base settled into a quieter rhythm, the details began to surface, not in a dramatic briefing or an urgent call, but in pieces. A note in a log. A comment passed between officers who trusted each other enough to speak plainly. That was when we learned how close one of the convoys had come to entering an unverified zone without the update I had been carrying. It was not a hostile area in the way people imagine. No enemy waiting, no immediate threat. Just a stretch of terrain that had not been cleared for movement during that phase of the exercise. Communications coverage there was unreliable. Range control had not signed off. If the convoy had crossed that line, procedures would have been broken without anyone realizing it until afterward. Nothing dramatic happened because the delay did not stretch far enough. But it almost did. The convoy had paused at a checkpoint, waiting for a confirmation that never came because the system still believed my authorization was invalid. They sat there, engines idling, crews growing impatient, assuming the hold was temporary. Another few minutes, and someone might have made a decision to push forward anyway. It happens more often than people admit. Fatigue erodes patience. Confidence fills in gaps where information should be. The realization hit me quietly. There was no spike of adrenaline, no rush of fear after the fact. Just a steady understanding of how narrow that margin had been. I thought back to the gate, to the laughter, to the certainty in the guards' voices when they trusted the screen more than the person in front of them. None of it felt malicious in hindsight. It felt human. And that was what made it dangerous. An apology came later, delivered privately by a senior officer who had reviewed the timeline. It was sincere. He acknowledged the delay, the system failure, and the way the situation had unfolded at the gate. I accepted it and moved on. Apologies serve a purpose, but they are not the point. What stayed with me was the margin, how much the outcome depended on minutes. on whether someone was willing to press past comfort and challenge a system that appeared authoritative, on whether responsibility was treated as a burden to avoid or a duty to carry. I replayed the moment I rested my hand on the access panel. How small the action had been. How large the consequences could have become if I had chosen to step back instead. Military service teaches you to respect systems. It also teaches you that systems are built by people, and people make mistakes. The balance between trust and scrutiny is fragile, and when it tips too far in either direction, things break. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, listening to the hum of generators outside my quarters. I imagined a convoy moving, the line it almost crossed, the reports that would have followed if someone had pushed forward without clearance. Training exercise or not, consequences have a way of teaching lessons harshly. No one was hurt. No equipment was damaged. On paper, the day was a success. But the knowledge of how close we came to a different outcome stayed with me in a way no reprimand ever could. It settled into my understanding of responsibility, deep and permanent. Because in the military, it is often not the disasters that define you. It is the ones that almost happen and the quiet choices that prevent them. When I drove past the gate that evening, the light had shifted. The heat of the day was fading, and the desert had settled into that quiet stretch where sound carries farther than it should. The same guards were on duty. I recognized them immediately. They stood straighter this time, posture deliberate, movements precise. One of them nodded as I passed. It was not dramatic, just a small, respectful acknowledgement. I returned the nod and kept driving. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory. If anything, it made the weight of the day feel heavier. Because what had changed at that gate was not about me. It was about awareness. I did not hold resentment toward them. I never did. They were doing what people are trained to do when systems appear certain. They trusted what was in front of them. Most of us do. Screens feel authoritative. They offer clean answers in situations where judgment feels risky. That is how systems earn loyalty. But loyalty without thought is dangerous. As I drove, I replayed the day from the beginning. The early warning signs, the failed update, the way everyone, including me, initially expected the problem to resolve itself. It is comforting to believe that errors will correct themselves if given time. It absolves us of having to intervene. What the day reinforced for me was something the military teaches quietly, often without words. Responsibility does not always come with permission. Sometimes it arrives as a choice between stepping forward and staying comfortable. I thought about the junior leader at the gate, the hesitation in his voice when the calls started coming in. I thought about the guard's confidence dissolving into silence once the system corrected itself. Not because they were weak, but because certainty had been replaced with truth. That transition is never easy. Back at my quarters, I sat for a long time without turning on the lights. The hum of the base continued around me. Vehicles moved. Doors opened and closed. The exercise would be discussed in briefings and reviews, reduced to bullet points and recommendations. But the human part of it would not make it into those slides. No one would document the moment when laughter stopped, or the quiet fear that followed when people realized they had almost trusted the wrong thing. Those details live only in memory, carried by the people who were there. I knew changes would come. Procedures would be adjusted, verification thresholds tightened, training refreshed. That is how institutions respond to near failures. They improve quietly and move on. What mattered more to me was the internal shift. I had been reminded that authority is not about demanding trust. It is about carrying responsibility when trust falters. It is about acting not because it feels good, but because it feels necessary. That night, I slept lightly. Not from stress, but from awareness. The kind that lingers after you realize how thin the line can be between order and confusion. The next morning, the base returned to routine. The gate looked the same. The systems hummed along as if nothing had happened. And for most people, nothing had. But I carried the lesson forward, not as resentment, not as pride, as a reminder. Systems will fail again, people will trust them again. And someone, somewhere, will be standing in front of a barrier with information that does not match the screen. When that moment comes, I hope they remember that responsibility sometimes means overriding assumptions. Quietly, decisively, without needing recognition. Because the true measure of service is not how loudly authority arrives. It is how calmly it acts when it must. I think about that moment more often than I expected. Not because I was questioned, and not because anyone apologized afterward, but because of how small the decision was that shifted everything. One tap. One quiet choice to act instead of argue, to trust responsibility over comfort. In the military, authority is rarely loud. It does not always come with raised voices or visible symbols. Most of the time, it shows up as accountability. When systems fail, when screens disagree with reality, someone still has to answer for the outcome. Someone has to decide whether to step forward or step aside. That day, I was ready to be that person. What stayed with me was not the sudden change in posture at the gate or the respect that followed. Those things fade quickly. What stayed was the reminder that competence often goes unnoticed until it is challenged. And when it is challenged, hesitation carries a cost that does not always announce itself in time. No one was hurt that day. Nothing made the news. On paper, it was a routine exercise with a minor delay. But I know how close it came to becoming something else, and that knowledge settled deep. Military service is full of moments like that. Quiet ones. Moments where the right action does not feel dramatic or satisfying, just necessary. Moments where doing your job means accepting responsibility without expecting recognition. I carry that lesson with me still. Not as pride and not as resentment, but as awareness. Systems will fail again. People will trust them again, and someone will be faced with a choice that feels small but is not. When that moment comes, I hope they choose action over assumption. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.